So welcome to Radio Free Montclair. It's the third year of Montclair Design Week. It's day 5 of this year's program. I'm Ian Kerr, part of the large core team of MDW and a member of the eco-consultancy SPURS. We're really excited about today's program where we'll be discussing the Commons with David Bollier. For us at MDW, the Commons as a framework and ethos has become more and more central to our mission of citizen-led design of all aspects of our collective lives. This year, this program is one of an amazing series of related programming where we have Afrofuturist planning and design, participatory budgeting, ecology in the Commons, new models of creativity. We're also doing some really interesting programming with our partners at the University of Orange around public space and main streets. Also, our daily radio series at noon, Please Explain, has a number of related programs. So to our audience listening on live stream, you can post questions and comments with the icon in the upper right corner of your screen. And that this is part of our year-round programming. If you're really interested, join us, suggest other events in this series, and welcome. So with that said, I want to welcome David Bollier and say a few words of introduction. David's an author, activist, and consultant who's been at the forefront of developing the Commons as a new paradigm of economics, politics, culture, and more for over 20 years. He's the co-founder of the Commons Strategy Group, the director of the Reinventing the Commons program at the Schumacher Center for New Economics, and the author of many really good books and articles. Think Like a Commoner, The Wealth of the Commons, and most recently, Free, Fair, and Alive. Both of the last two were written with Silke Hilfrich,
yes.
This is an amazing book. I highly recommend it, The Free, Fair, and Alive. So David, welcome. It's really wonderful to have you here.
Thank you.
So I just want to jump right in, David, with a question. So you begin Free, Fair, and Alive by saying the Commons today offers us a way of overcoming fear with a surge of a reality-based hope outside of the conventional institutions that are failing us, and one that will give us a new politics of belonging. And so for those who don't know, how would you define the Commons, and what makes it so relevant today?
Well, the common to ask for a single definition is like saying, what is a market? Meaning there's no essentialist definition, that it's enacted by people all the time, and it's more the verb of commoning than the noun of the commons. So it's not as if a definition can totally encapsulate it. Having said that, it's really a system by which people choose collectively to manage some shared wealth, whether it's software code or land or public spaces, in a participatory, fair, inclusive, open-minded way. And it's an alternative to the market and the state as systems of governance and as systems of providing things, because it has its own logic and its own ethic and its own worldview in how that commonwealth is managed. And for precisely that reason, the market and the state, or as I call it, the market state system, because they're so allied, has marginalized that the commons, and indeed sees it as a focal point for taking stuff for free without compensation. The way corporations take land and timber and minerals on our public lands, the way they strip mine government-sponsored information resources, and the way colonialism and imperialism have taken all sorts of material resources from the global south. So the commons has been marginalized, but in recent years it's been rediscovered, you might say. It's kind of an old new paradigm, rediscovered for precisely the reasons that neoliberal capitalism has been exceedingly aggressive in taking the shared wealth. And also the internet has provided a very fertile platform for people to create their own self-organized solutions. And not just the internet, but that's been the most salient vehicle for creating everything from open source software to Wikipedia to countless collaborative websites. So that's maybe a preamble into what the commons is, and we can get into more examples and discussion about it as we go along.
And I want to just, as a way of elucidating a bit more about the commons, could you say like why, I should maybe to back up a bit. For a lot of people who are coming from a classical economics and political framework, market political framework as you see it, they immediately, when we talk about the commons, bring up something like the tragedy of the commons. Like this is a model that won't work, that doesn't work. So I want to start by just asking you, why is that false?
Well, for one thing, he's not describing a commons. He's describing an open access regime or a free-for-all when you can take whatever you want and there's no rules, there's no community, there's no punishment of transgressors of rules, and so forth. So really, it's been a misnomer from the start. The idea of the tragedy of the commons really got its start with Garrett Hardin, a biologist, with a famous essay that he wrote in 1968 called The Tragedy of the Commons, which appeared in Science Journal. And he basically said, imagine you have an open pasture and you're a farmer and you can put as many cattle on it as you wish. Nobody will have a rational motivation for withholding, and more people, there'll be more cattle on the common than could sustain it. It will be overexploited and ruined, resulting in the tragedy of the commons. Well, that wasn't a commons, that was a free-for-all. And moreover, it was treating the commons just as a resource, a physical thing of like a piece of land. It took the work of Eleanor Ostrom, a political scientist at Indiana University, who spent her career studying lots of self-organized commons in rural contexts, especially in poorer global South countries, forest, fishery, land, wild game, many things like that, and showed as an empirical matter that it's perfectly possible and frequent and common for people to self-organize these systems of governance and provisioning through commons. And for her work, she won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2009. And it was, I might add, the first time a woman had won that prize in economics. And it was right after the 2008 financial crisis. And I have to believe the Nobel Committee wanted somebody with a kinder, nicer, more humane version of economics. And she had studied her life, spent her life showing how cooperation and relationships are actually economically consequential, something that most of her male colleagues had really ignored, and the economics profession continues to ignore. So the point is that she helped intellectually and in a scholarly way and in an empirical way validate the commons as an alternative system for meeting needs.
I think that's really important what you were saying at the beginning about the tragedy of the commons, that that's not a commons but a free-for-all. And what's important when we're thinking about a commons is that it is organized. It's just organized differently. And it's not that there's just a large resource and everyone claiming their share of it.
I mean, there's a reflex among politicians and economists and other mainstream intelligentsia to, well, if you consider politicians intelligentsia, but for considering space a commons, oceans the commons, the internet as a commons. And it is true that there are resources that many people use and perhaps want to share, but in truth, they're not really commons. We don't really have regimes for managing them as commons. The point of a commons as a system of governance and provisioning is relationships. It's not supply and demand curves or the physical resource supposedly having some essential value. it's people's relationships with each other and how they come together to communicate, negotiate differences and conflicts, set rules, set enforcement for those who break the rules, and essentially how they act as stewards of resources over the long term without having the standard growth imperatives that capitalism has.
Yeah.
So it's a very different regime.
So with that kind of foundation for us to build on, David, I just, tracing your own development through what you've written about the commons, I see an evolution from more of a focus on the commons as collective resource management and closer to alternatives to classical economics. And you've moved, it feels like, deeper and deeper into seeing the commons as a total holistic, and you described as an ontological, sort of paradigmatically different way of thinking about our personhood or environment. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that shift and talk about what that shift in general to commoning means.
Sure. Well, that's a big topic and embraces like much of the past 30 or 40 years for me, in the sense that I first got on the tail of this topic when I was working for Ralph Nader in the 70s and 80s. And a lot of my colleagues then, and Nader himself, were combating what you could call enclosures of the commons, what we would call that now. It was more characterized in terms of the privatization of public assets, land, information, medical research, and so forth, in which companies saw government-sponsored wealth, our wealth, as something that was free for the taking. And a lot of us were trying to fight that and try to get fair value for it, or at least get the public to have benefits from it. But the deeper I got into this, the way that it was seen in terms of economics and policy and politics, the more I realized that this went to first of all, it was not a resource-focused phenomena, it was a social phenomena. And therefore it was more about social practice and culture and tradition and ways in which people had relationships with resources. And I saw how the Western way of thinking, especially post-Enlightenment, is filled with all these, what you could call artificial separations, separation between humans and nature, the separations of humans from each other, and the focus on really extreme individualism as the agency for everything, and separation from ourselves as a result. And the more I got into the commons, the more I saw that it really is more of a social and cultural phenomena, which then implicates us as individuals. And in my last book with Silke Helfrich, Free, Fair, and Alive, we came to realize that a lot of the language itself that we use to talk about the commons is so freighted with biases and presumptions that we don't share.
Yeah.
For example, in American culture, it's presumed that the individual is the primary actor and agent for everything. But we realize, the way evolutionary biologists and scientists do, that the individual is nested within a collective, nested within a history of intergenerational culture. And so we talk about the nested I, because the I is not totally autonomous, the way the free market theory and of the Homo economicus as this rational individual actor is. And therefore, a commoner is in constant dynamic relationships with others, which is not to say they're simply an automaton the way communism asserts, which itself is more of a state system. This is a bottom-up differentiated behavior. Everybody has their individuality, but they come together to figure out how to manage their shared wealth. So as this brief description and our introduction suggests, there's a different ontological foundation for the commons than the standard economics, standard politics, even modernity. And that's part of our challenge today. And I think that climate change is telling us that, you know what, we've got the wrong mindset for approaching some of these problems. And we could learn a lot from indigenous people about how to live in harmony and dynamic relationship with the earth and natural systems, instead of saying that's inert deadness that I can use however I want. I find that reframing the commons in this fashion just opens up a whole new way of thinking and a whole new set of solutions that simply aren't available through conventional politics, policy, and law.
Yeah, I mean, that's in Free, Fair, and Alive, such an important section of the book where you look at, on one hand, our standard set of words, metaphors and frameworks, the individual, all the set of words relating to politics and sociality, citizen development, leadership, nonprofit governance, innovation, corporations, participation, scarcity, and to realize that as soon as we enter that way of speaking and way of thinking, we're inside, as you say, the ontology or the worldview of that, and that we need to, again, from the bottom up, work ourselves out by developing a new language and a new type of embodied understanding. And I think this is where, I think one could pass over what you're saying, where it's a system of relationships really fast and go, yeah, I get it. We all have relationships. But, you're putting a relational world at the, I don't want to say fundament, but this is at the core of
I think it's frankly empirically true, because simply at a biological level. I mean, when you think of the number of microorganisms that make up the human biome, we bleed into the ecosystem in a quite literal way, that our individuation as an individual person is kind of a fiction in a way, because we are so entangled biologically with the rest of the world. So once you start to take this seriously and start to say, well, maybe our social and political systems ought to reflect these facts, and maybe we wouldn't be so vulnerable to something like the pandemic, which has reminded us that we're biological creatures embedded in a living earth, as opposed to somebody who could say, oh, the earth, that's over there, that's separate from humankind. So that's an example of how I think the language of the commons opens up some new intellectual vistas for understanding our contemporary problems.
Yeah, and I think, just to say really fast before we move on, but there's, as you're saying, a set of profound shifts in the sciences, looking at, symbiotics, symbiogenesis, which is the study of how, there's this mutualistic relationship between billions of microbes, the human organism, and how it affects every part of us, and how you can't disentangle any part of these systems and build it up, and even how classical ecology did as these food webs, where it's distinct creatures, but even that, as you say, is a fiction. And so I think what's so illuminating is once you move to a commons model at this deeper level, as you're saying, you see a whole other set of connections to, the sciences of complexity, emergence, relational ecology. And I think it gives you a way of navigating, as you're saying, both, political crises, ecological crises, and having an alternative framework and toolkit.
Well, maybe this is a moment to sort of take that point seriously and show how there are certain social institutions we can build based on those premises. And this is not simply an academic seminar or armchair discussion about the way the world might look, but there's all sorts of functional commons out there that are based on the principles of relationality. And I'll just go through a handful of different arenas in which this is playing out. I mean, first of all, we should note that subsistence commons, where you're basically raising food for your household or community, not for the market, especially not for global and international markets, is now 2 billion people do that to this day. But standard economics textbooks don't regard it as relevant because there's no cash changing hands or no market activity going on. So it's essentially a major activity that's, for the most part, ecologically benign, that is ignored by standard economics. But those are mostly commons. And even in the developed, so-called developed world, we're trying to develop greater relocalization of food systems through things like agroecology and permaculture, the slow food movement, lots of organic and local food. And these systems are place-based systems that are less market-focused, less focused on return on investment than on serving the needs of a community. So those are just sort of two major sectors, but I'll just tick through things like the city as a commons or urban commons is getting a lot of traction in Europe these days in places like Amsterdam and Barcelona and various cities in Italy, where they're trying to reclaim city governance and provisioning of needs from investors and the affluent, and to show that urban gardens and public spaces and self-managed farmers markets and urban community land trusts and co-housing can all be ways to make the city more livable and to give people more say in their life in the city, as opposed to absentee investors doing that. There's the internet is a vast hosting infrastructure for commons. I alluded to a few things going on there, but even though the corporate things like Google and Facebook and Twitter and so forth get most of the attention because they're corporate run, there are plenty of online commons out there in which it's run by a community of users who have a shared interest, whether it's in software code or data or academic knowledge or scientific things. So again, a major regime for sharing wealth. There's alternative currencies. The Schumacher Center in Western Massachusetts has the Berkshires, which it helps manage. But around the world, there's scores of such alternative currencies whose chief value is to keep the locally generated value local instead of it being siphoned away by the banks and governments from the local community. And I could touch on many other areas that might be of interest. Maybe you should ask questions if there's any special areas, but the point is a commons can arise in any context when people want to manage something for their shared benefit. There's a theater commons called HowlRound Theater Commons in Boston. There's this group of humanitarian map makers called Humanitarian OpenStreetMap Team, that when there's a natural disaster, they instantly create lots of digital maps to help first responders. And another commons. So it's not as if the commons are classified by their resource as such, but more by the social commitment to do things in reciprocal ways for mutual benefit.
So I'd like to dig into that for a second, David. So you define this as like the triad of commoning, and that there's always these three aspects of peer governance, social life, and provisioning. Could you walk us through that?
Yeah, well, we were inspired by a somewhat heterodox architect and urban planner, Christopher Alexander, who wrote a series of books, many of them dealing with pattern languages and patterns. And his ideas, well, he was asking, why do certain design features recur across cultures, across time, and why are they so popular and persistent? And his basic answer, to put it crudely, is that there are certain social behaviors and patterns that result in things are satisfying both in an inner way as well as meeting functional needs. And there are certain clusters of solutions to a similar problem that constitute patterns. And we, in trying to think through the countless commons that Silke Helfrich and I had seen, knew that we couldn't have a single blueprint for saying these are the principles for a commons, because a commons is always drawing upon the specific context, the geography, the history, the culture, the values, the language. And so any commons will bear the markings in a deep way of that local context. And so by talking about patterns, we're able to say, this is the general framework of solutions to these problems, like how do we allocate things fairly? How do we govern ourselves? How do we resolve conflicts? And many things like that. So we tried to identify recurrent patterns of comedy. And as you said, we developed 3 major spheres: provisioning, peer governance, and social life, in which we have perhaps about a dozen patterns in each, which they tend to recur in the commons we see, irrespective of the resource that it may be managing, even though, of course, resources do matter in how you manage them, because some resources like land, there's only so much of it, whereas things like software code can be reproduced for virtually no cost. So that's the logic behind the patterns, and we wanted to get to the inner experience of a commons as opposed to behavioralistic external norms, the way Eleanor Ostrom or economists look at commons. So this was more the inner life of a commons and how that plays out in managing shared wealth.
I want to go into some of the patterns that appear, because I think it gives people a real sense of what you're talking about on the ground. So, especially I think terms like provisioning can be opaque. So I want to start with provisioning, and if you could just run with how you're understanding that term, and then if we can have we'll get to a few patterns in there.
Okay. Well, we use the word provisioning because we didn't want to use the word production, because we know that that's always paired with consumption. And part of the problem is that in the standard economics, the producers and consumers are different people, whereas in a commons, they're the same people, albeit collectively. And so provisioning struck us as a way to get out of the standard economic taxonomy to talk about, well, how are needs provided for, which is what provisioning is. And so there's not necessarily an economic transaction going on the way the market, or for that matter, a market. Commons may have side relationships with markets in a limited, self-controlled way, but the point is they're not an internal market among themselves where everybody's charging each other money for this or that, which means they have a whole different set of social relationships with each other than me producer, you consumer, let's transact.
I mean, I think even Design Week in this radio series is a great example where, as you say, the producing and the consuming are the same. We're the same community that's making this is the community, listening in and then thinking of like, how do I make the next thing? So it's that direct. You have a number of, so that's the make and use together, support and care, support care, decommodify work, share risk of provisioning, the contributing and sharing of skills. Could you talk a bit about, one that I'm really interested in, and I think would also relate to our more part of the design community here, is what you guys mean by convivial tools?
Well, that's a term that has its origins or popularization in the late social critic Ivan Illich, who in the 60s and 70s wrote a number of books about the problems of institutions. He wrote a book called Medical Nemesis about the problems of
deschooling society
and many others. And he invented the term of convivial tools, meaning tools that don't prescribe exactly how you have to use them, the way, for example, Windows or proprietary software says you have to do it this way. A convivial tool is something you can use however you choose to meet whatever your needs are as they evolve. And so they're very open and versatile rather than closed and proprietary. And this for us was a very important principle because the commons is about self-determination and freedom.
Yeah.
And you need tools that allow you to do things the way open source allows you to adapt the software and not simply adopt what you buy off the shelf from the major companies. So for us, it's a very important principle of commenting that you have tools that you can use the way you want them to for your purposes.
I think there's a great part that Illich has there, where he compares, for example, the car and the bike. And, he says that once you have cars, everyone's forced to adopt them because cars produce larger and larger distances, the distance of commuting to work and what have you. So most people, once cars become the dominant form of transportation, even if you wish not to, the way they reorganize and pattern cities and communities and countries and infrastructure, you're stuck with it. You have to adopt it. Whereas something like a bike, on the other hand, is a convivial tool because, bikes don't mean great distances. They don't mean perfect roads. They don't mean exclusivity.
They're more human scale in that respect,
Yeah,
in a bodily sense.
Yeah. And so I think this is a really important thing I think for the designers in our world to consider how radically distinct, like it's not just about a better car, like certain types of products and practices move us out of conviviality.
I totally agree with that. And I would just add another word into the mix, which I found very useful, which is the idea of affordances.
Yes.
What does the superstructure or the tool afford us to do? What does it allow or enable or empower us to do? Just like a bicycle has different affordances than a car, certain systems have different affordances. And once they lock in, we don't really have the individual agency to change them.
Yeah.
It's a collective issue. It's a structural issue.
Yeah.
And I think that's the commons offers all sorts of affordances that in the market state system of centralized power, hierarchical systems, command and control, you simply don't have. It's a more locked up, closed system with somewhat narrow objectives, namely capital accumulation, versus the more, how do we live our lives in a way that helps us flourish in this context, in this reality right now. And so there's a different set of questions that are asked and a different set of solutions that emerge.
Yeah, I want to move on, but I love this term affordance, and we use it a lot, and I think it's really a contrast between terms like purpose, use, which are defined and fixed. This has that. Whereas convivial tools, as you say, provide affordances, and affordances are always situated. Back to your idea of place-based local models, and affordances emerge. I want to move. I think social life we can understand in your triad, but peer governance this is a really important concept, and then set of patterns you see in it. So I'd love you to say a few words about peer governance.
Well, I should refresh my memory of some of the key patterns there, because the idea is that we often think of governance as people who are the government, who are controlling someone else and different. Whereas in a commons, peer governance means you're all governing yourselves. There's not an external body or leader. And so it has some different dynamics. It's more integrated. And this requires, I might add, the three aspects of the triad are all interrelated. It's not as if they're all entirely separate. So the social life of the commons is about, just as in peer governance, bringing diversity into shared purpose. And this requires conversations, meetings, as well as fun and festivals. And it's about how do you grow into each other as a community while retaining your diverse individual perspectives. It's about things like sharing knowledge generously. It's about assuring consent and decision making. And then we talk about the word heterarchy, which is kind of almost the opposite of hierarchy. Heterarchy is where you don't have defined roles within this massive system like a cog in a machine, but it's more modular, flexible, changeable. And commons tend to work better if there can be that kind of flexibility of roles, which is precisely why a commons can respond more flexibly and fast than maybe a lot of hierarchies. We saw that when the pandemic first hit, how spontaneous mutual aid networks were going boom, creating their own masks for distribution and meeting people's needs for groceries and so forth. And that's because they acted in a very, very hierarchical way. It wasn't if there was a central command saying, this is the way you do it and you do it our way. And so there's this kind of flexibility and versatility in the commons if they're working governed through a hierarchical norms. So those are some of the key aspects. One other aspect I would mention of peer governance is we talk about semi-permeable membranes around the commons, because so often people were saying, well, don't you have strict boundaries of what's your private property as a commons? And we realize that the idea of bright line boundaries of property don't really describe it adequately any more than you could say your body as a living organism has property boundaries around it, because it's a semi-permeable membrane, because a living system has to constantly interact with its environment and at the same time screen out potentially dangerous or threatening forces, be it chemicals or bad air or poisons and so forth. So the point is, a commons is a living social organism that's interacting with its environment, and it needs to interact in fluid, flexible ways with semi-permeable membranes, while at the same time preventing those dangerous aspects of the external environment from threatening it, whether by buying it or propertizing it or trying to treat it as a fungible commodity that doesn't have a rooted context in an ecosystem, for example. So those are some principles that we identified in successful commons in how they're governed.
I mean, you talk there about the danger of being co-opted. I want to ask you about the inverse, which is like how the creative practices to make more semi-permeable membranes, to make systems more heterarchical. And, you know, and I think just to say, you know, to connect with our direct audience and tell you, David, you know, that's exactly what happened here with COVID. Immediately, you know, the sort of mutual aid groups and, you know, Design Week as a kind of distributed organization could respond quickly, non-hierarchically. You know, face shields were made, food was grown and distributed, you know, needs were found, support was given. So, you know, I think for people listening, you know, we are co-evolving a commons in each of those acts. And I wonder how, you know, so my question to you, David, is like, how do we grow that?
Well, I think there's some remarkable parallels with biological systems, or what shall I say, biodiversity,
Yeah.
meaning you intensify the relationships you have and you complexify and diversify them too. And I think the rainforest is such an incredible generative space precisely for that reason. There's such a density of interconnections and symbiosis going on there. And I think with our commons too, that once you reach a certain critical mass and diversity, you start to become almost spontaneously generative in having new aspirations and validating a way of life, a way of meeting needs in a system that is American culture that's often quite hostile to that.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think, which is not, we get into larger territory of the complexities of not having the infrastructure and finance systems and legal recognition that is also needed. But I'm saying purely as a social phenomena, I think you grow it by that kind of relationship building, and a lot of stuff derives from that.
I mean, I like your example because it goes back to our discussion we had, I think it was just yesterday, about race and ecology, and this, the fundamental sort of white suprematist model where nature and culture are entirely separate, and that's how best to see it, where Amazonia turns out to be entirely co-shaped. So that complexity that you're talking about is part because it's coming from a relational human non-human framework.
We might add that a lot of people don't realize that the Amazon in prehistoric times was deeply shaped by human beings. It wasn't simply a wild nature doing its thing.
Yeah.
There's been many of those symbiotic relationships between human communities and natural systems, such that, well, the book 1491 about the biological realities of North America before contact, and then how the ecosystem changed dramatically after settlers arrived.
Absolutely. So that's another whole important trajectory there. So I want to, I think we have a question that would be really great to, at this point where we're talking about intensifying relationships, spontaneous generation. And maybe before answering it, I just want to say, because I know our live stream wasn't working right at the beginning, but please, you can comment and ask questions by using the icon in the upper right-hand corner of your live stream. So we would love, as we move into the last 20 minutes, to answer questions and hear from the audience. So David, we have a question: how are emergent communities different from the commons?
Well, let's just say some emergent communities don't have any desire to remain a community as they grow.
Yeah.
I think some of them are staging areas for capitalism. I mean, if you think of something like a lot of open source software programs like Linux, well, they do remain somewhat of a community, but there's been a lot of companies that have kind of invested in those communities as a infrastructure and made them into feeding grounds for capitalism.
Yeah.
So something emergent may or may not be a commons or aspire, but that's where the human intentionality and purpose matters so much. And that's where the social practice and culture matters. But, emergence happens in a lot of different contexts, and not all of them want to socially cooperate for their own and the greater good. So I guess I don't think I can provide a bright line example, except that you could say that a lot of commercial ecosystems are emergent. They don't have any cooperative goals except so far as it might facilitate their goal of private accumulation of capital.
Yeah, I think in some way, like the term emergent gets thought of as having an ethical value, like it's a positive term, where it's really ontological description of how things actually happen is there's many forces and something emerges from it that's non-linear.
Well, it's a huge advance conceptually over 20th century industrial ideas that are mechanistic and linear.
Yeah.
And complexity theory from, say, the late 80s on has helped popularize this different framework. And it's been especially explanatory in a lot of the sciences. But in truth, a lot of that hasn't been applied to human communities, let alone given an ethical or spiritual or social dimension. It's been more of a physics or biological phenomena, to the extent that there are enough dissidents who buy into this perspective. I mean, the Santa Fe Institute, which helped popularize complexity theory, was really kind of a renegade operation for many, many years before complexity theory slowly insinuated itself into the rest of popular discourse.
I want to ask you in that aspect related to this question then about a commons term that you use that might be relevant to this, which is the term you call beating the bounds.
Well, that's a wonderful term from medieval commons, where in English commons, to the community as a public ritual and festival to protect its shared land, would march around the perimeter of their common land. And if anybody had built a hedge or a fence to privatize part of it, they would knock it down. And this whole annual ritual of beating the bounds, walking the perimeter of their common land, was a way of protecting the integrity and sustainability of their shared wealth as a commons.
Yeah.
And so you could say it's a metaphor for our time. We don't have enough social systems to beat the bounds, to patrol the integrity of our shared wealth. And therefore, more often than not, it is privatized and cannibalized, despoiled, and so forth. And so the part of the challenge that any group of commoners faces is creating the semi-permeable membrane, the beating of the bounds exercises to protect their commons from the inevitable attempted enclosures, while still having the vitality of having interactions with the rest of the world, and not just becoming a cult or a small operation. So I love beating of the bounds for that reason, because it makes very vivid something that is a community festival of fun and very functional as well.
I think this refusal and protection against enclosure is both conceptual and physical tool that's in the terms is great, because it's also it's a creative tool. It's like where you're looking both for enclosure and encroachment, but you're also thinking, how do we make the world more semi-permeable? How do we extend this possibility? How do we take back what's been privatized, what's been commoditized? How do we bring that into the fold of commoning?
See, and you just stated precisely the kind of question that you can't get from standard politics or economics, because they presume the primacy of the individual, and these kind of collective concerns, well, that's for the government to worry about. Don't you worry your little head about it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's what I love about the commons, is that it helps us conceptually, philosophically, practically get a grip on how our shared wealth can be protected.
We've been beating the bounds in a creative way with a very simple act of urban foraging, as an example. Because you have to trespass onto your neighbor's lawn. You have to see that this is one ecosystem. So you're making it more porous, and then it becomes a shared responsibility, and we can go to somebody and say, why are you spraying it? Why are you doing this?
Well, and what it does also is it breaks down, it challenges the whole notion of private property.
Yeah.
Some sacrosanct and perfectly isolated body of something, when of course ecosystem and life is so interpenetrating and flowing through different lines that property boundaries are ridiculous in that sense.
Absolutely. So I want to, as we come closer to the end, I'm wondering, I have a couple questions. And the first is what would be your, how do we become commoners today? What are the big things you'd say, let's do this?
Well, it's partly growing into the identity that you're not a citizen whose primary focus is the state. You're not a consumer whose primary focus, or producer whose primary focus is the market. You're a commoner, which I could regard as a pre-political, pre-standard economics identity of humanness, of relationality, of reciprocal mutual aid. And I think it's partly the practices of doing that is the only way you're going, and the experiences that you can develop that identity. But it's also about developing the institutions, the forms of the many that I've mentioned, and even going beyond that, developing the infrastructures and supporting state legal or policy structures to encourage commoning, and commoning as an activity, and not just commoner as this static identity.
Yeah.
So a commons is as a commoner does, and it has to be, people have to be involved in those activities to develop that identity.
I like where you say that, the commoner is as the commoner does, and that you have that somewhere here where, every commons arises through commoning, which has these three symbiotic aspects of social habits, peer governance, and provisioning, and to see that. So I have two questions in the last little bit. So the first one I want to ask, and this really came out of our last discussion on race and ecology, is, where right now, with the Black Lives Movement, there's a real awareness of the profound racist structural logic of America, and there's a need to deconstruct and challenge it at every level. And I wonder how this has challenged you and the commoning movement in the States.
Well, I think that it obviously is something that's extremely important to address. In some ways, it's related to many of the liberation efforts in countries that have been colonized and dispossessed. And of course, slavery is an extreme form of dispossession that other commoners have experienced in one way or another, all of them driven by the standard forces of capital growth and private accumulation. I think the challenge facing many commoners is to enter into deeper conversations with many of these communities, whether they're indigenous people, Native Americans, or African Americans, who frankly need some collective reparations for a lot of this. And I think there's a number of commons-based vehicles that could be explored from, well, there's been a long tradition of cooperatives in the African American community. I think community land trusts could be a great way to provide reparations and open the door for farming and agriculture and local sovereignty, food sovereignty. So I think that these ways would be empowering in a broader collective way, but it's not my role to be making such an agenda. I think these have to be conversations in a broader way, and I think they could be a source of healing the social fabric and showing that there are some post-capitalist possibilities that are not just about giving everybody their supposed startup capital and let's go at it through competition, but how can we devise some new types of social institutions that really take fairness, personal and social security seriously? And because we know that the market system is a very flawed design for meeting people's social security and empowerment. So let's explore some of these very different types of institutions, and I'd welcome those kinds of conversations.
I think there's a number of, I just want to iterate what you've said. There's a number of important parts here. I think first that, the model is coming from the global South in many regards, and it's coming from, a decolonializing movement. And, I think we often see the commons as something perhaps of, a European origin, an English origin, in the words and in the agricultural practices. It's really, as you are talking about in your work, as a pattern language. It's something that's emerging from, not just historically, but in current lived practice today from the global South is really.
I would love, for example, the principles of buen vivir,
yes,
good livelihood, to have a conversation about that, because you're right, the commons does have its origins as a concept in European and English history, but there are lots of, what shall I say, kin concepts and practices that could be a very enriching dialogue among them. So I don't have any sense of, excuse the term, imperialism
Yeah.
about the commons, because I think it's manifested in a lot of ways that don't even use the word. And
Absolutely. And I think what's so interesting about the Bowlier movements is how, in some sense, this could be contentious, but they supersede the degrowth movement with a positive productivist, creative way of enacting these rather than a negation.
I agree, but I would also add two things. One, some of us Western moderns have the struggle of growing out of that.
Yes.
And we were not born indigenous.
Yeah.
It doesn't come as naturally. And so we have our own struggles to reclaim our authentic humanity, which is why, I don't think we should get into a pissing match about whether the commons versus these others. It's more different fractal variations of the same thing in different contexts. The other thing I might just say is that I think there is more of a convergence in set of transnational conversations going on among many of these different players, because there's a realization that this is a global problem that manifests and plays out in different contexts, different national and political contexts. And there's a struggle from commoners to try to, I think, articulate and push back in a more coherent way than simply stop this, you're bad corporations, you're a bad state. And to have the affirmative vision, which is what I think is so powerful about the commons, and I think about Bowlier and those other life-affirming approaches to social change.
So I want to just come to, I think there's so much to say about so many areas, but as we end the conversation, I think you were talking about an ethical and spiritual worldview of commoning, and I just want to end with like how, where do you ground that?
Well, I don't want to say it's a religion, but I do want to say that the commons does encourage you to, all of us, to engage with our innermost authentic lives, because that's part of interacting in a constructive, affirmative way with other people. And in the course of doing that, you start to shed a lot of artificial cultural and political traditions that I think are like a bad fitting suit of clothes these days, and that we need to sort of start to interrogate our own selves and our needs to grow different types of institutions and so forth. So I think this is something of a spiritual quest that, I don't think it's a doctrine or dogma driven thing. It's more of an experiential thing of being alive. My eco-philosopher friend, Andreas Weber, was at a conference recently where they asked, the question was, is the earth alive? And he turned it around and said, well, no, the real question should be, are we alive?
Yeah.
Or are we simply units of robotic intention that the state and the market are servicing and quasi-dead? So this is about learning how to be alive again, which is why the title is Free, Fair, and Alive.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful to even think of the verb of commoning as like, how do we become lively, alive, to push his question further, like, are we alive? Like, how are we making liveliness?
Check out Andreas Weber's book, Enlivenment, which deals with precisely that, but in the context of an ecosystem and biological analysis, because he regards biological reality as a commons.
Yeah.
And we're just part of that.
Yeah. I think that, comes back to, say, how the conversation between, say, Eleanor Ostrom and Lynn Margulis and
yes,
others overlap. there was a question from the audience earlier on, like, how do you deal with difference and discord in a commons model where if we get hyper local, if it's about community, and one community has like a radical, profound difference. We can think of all the differences today in America, whether it's about abortion, any number of things. How is that actually negotiated?
I think it's more easily, I can only speak, not only, but mostly speak to it in the context of individual commons as opposed to diverse societies, because that's a larger, more complex challenge that I think is beyond my scope. But I do think, to the extent that you encourage an ethic of reciprocity and cooperation and trust building and belonging, you get a long way to neutralizing from the get-go a lot of the contention and disputes. And a lot of conflicts we have are really gratuitously fueled by politicians who are trying to gain office, by competitive ethic of markets, by artificially hyped difference. Whereas commons, because they are getting out of that competitive ethic and the self-serving individualistic ethic, are cultivating a different base for collaboration, cooperation, meeting needs, providing security, which, if you have those, you're not going to be as contentious and have so many problems. So a lot of the patterns of commoning that we identify are really less about resolving conflicts than preventing them in the first place by getting people aligned and trusting in each other.
And I think that's, the building of reciprocity as a first act in a way.
Yeah.
Is so profound. To think of governance, in your model of peer governance, is it's not like, let's start with, what are now the rules we're going to put in place to make whatever happen, but like, let's simply build trust. Let's build reciprocity. Let's build relationality. Let's build intradependence.
Shared commitment. And
yeah,
a lot flows so naturally from that. And I'm reminded of when a geological scientist was in Canada trying to survey what was going on there, and they wanted to use some First Nations land. And of course they were resisting because they had just been ripped off or abused for so many times. And I said, so what did you do to try to gain the knowledge of the ecosystem and the geology there? And he said, well, we had to build a relationship of trust.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can't have a policy prescription or governance rule or law that can force that. So let's just get elemental about these things and build trust, and a lot of positive things will flow out of that.
I think that's so, like, to me, what's so eye-opening, like just in Free, Fair, and Alive, where you talk about this triad of commoning, is like, when you look at, if you look at the big terms, provisioning social life and peer governance, and then, we put aside your book and we just think what we would put in there, coming from a classical political model, whether it's socialist or, market-driven capitalism, they're so obvious after the fact, but so counterintuitive in the moment. Governance, I think, as we're saying, begins in reciprocity, trust building. It's not, let's make sure we establish the groundwork and rules, so, the terms you've already used, like bringing diversity into shared purpose, the semi-permeability of membranes, honoring transparency in the sphere of trust, sharing knowledge generously, assuring consent and decision-making, the production of heterarchies, the peer monitoring, the graduated sanctions that's coming from Ostrom. relational property, all of these, it's really, I just have to say, illuminating to see this as a pattern language of lists.
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm not a political theorist, but I have studied enough of liberal political theory to come to understand, especially since it's been allied with capital, that it colonizes the social and cultural world and transforms it in a way that is starting to make it disintegrate.
Yeah.
And I think that part of the theorists of the 17th or the 18th century took for granted the integrity and durability of our social system of civil society.
Yes.
In fact, we're seeing that the engines of the market state system are simply transforming our daily lives to suit their purposes and their power, and to the detriment of our core humanity. So I see commenting as a way of regenerating and revivifying some of the core elements of our humanity and social practice and governance.
Absolutely. I mean, that's right there in the subtitle of your previous book, A World Beyond Market and State.
Mm-hmm.
Well, David, it's so great to talk with you. We could keep going. There's so much. I would encourage people to, first of all, you have a really great website, Bowlier.org, BOLLIER.org. Your most recent book is so, has such an overarching systematic, synthetic view of your work and others' work, in collaboration with Silke, that I really would recommend to people. Free, Fair, and Alive: The Insurgent Power of the Commons. Are there other websites that you would point people to?
The blog roll in the right column of my homepage lists a number of the more prominent ones, but there's such things as the Common Network in Amsterdam, as it's called. There's a whole Francophone network of commoners. I might add that the Free, Fair, and Alive, the Spanish translation edition, is coming out next week, and there's a German edition, and soon we'll have a Greek and French version.
Yeah.
So, and there's even talk of a Chinese one, although I'm not sure how solid that is. But the point is, this resonates in a lot of different contexts. And frankly, I'm curious to see what people like you in Montclair and elsewhere do to sort of give greater visibility and creativity, because there's all sorts of unexpected things I keep encountering. Yeah. So I'm interested in what might emerge in your area.
Absolutely. One last, with the Bon Vivre movement, where would you suggest people look?
I know that there's an essay that we featured about it in the book Wealth of the Commons, and it's available online, wealthofthecommons.org, for free. Yeah. So you can find the chapter in that anthology on Bon Vivre. I might add that the book Patterns of Commoning is available online for free also at patternsofcommoning.org. That's
really good. So I think, we're definitely, David, trying to, as you're saying, develop this kind of creative space of reciprocity and building. So I want to mention to people as we close, this evening, we have a discussion about an expanded idea of creativity that's not human-centered at 7 p.m. that people could tune into. There's tomorrow on the future of Main Streets. There's design, data, inclusion tomorrow. There's what I was talking about, commons and ecology, on Friday at noon. There's a people-powered budgeting session, and I think that relates to what we were talking about, David, with a model of Barcelona and elsewhere in Europe. We're going to have a party on Friday night. Let's come out and dance. Saturday, we'll have a Reciprocal film festival. We all make a 100-second movie and we watch everyone's 100-second movie. So there's no division between producer and consumer. We're going to do a cycle through our larger system down to Newark and back. And then we're having a closing party the food will be entirely foraged from our commons. So I really encourage all our listeners to come out, also to participate in any way they want. And you should all bother David and in every possible way, and check out these resources. It's so great to be speaking with you, David, and it's so great to have your work.
Well, I'm thrilled to learn about you folks and the Design Shed and this festival of this week. So good luck with the rest of the festival, and I hope I've been helpful.
Absolutely. It's been super enlightening and insightful and
Great.
Invigorating.
Great.
Well, have a wonderful evening, and we'll talk soon.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, David.